Hey everyone, it's Bob Pulver. Welcome back to another episode of Elevate Your AIQ. Today I'm joined by my friend and fellow work futurist Chris Heuer, co-founder and managing director of Team Flow Institute. Chris and I go back a while and we routinely have insightful conversations about our shared interests in all manner of machine and human collaboration, the future of work, and all types of intelligence, human, collective, artificial, augmented, etc. Today we dig into how AI is reshaping the very fabric of teamwork, the rise of personal intelligence, and why it's time to rethink how we value human contributions in a world filled with agents and digital proxies and other terms entering our vernacular. Chris is doing fascinating and important work with the Team Flow Institute and is helping lead the charge on more human-centric approaches to AI integration, transformation, and innovation. This one goes pretty deep, but it's worth it, trust me. Thanks as always for listening, and let's get into it. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Elevate Your AIQ. I'm your host, Bob Pulver. With me today, I have my old friend, Chris Heuer. How you doing today, Chris?
Really well. Thanks for having me, Bob. I'm looking forward to exploring more of this with you.
Yeah, no, this is going to be a lot of fun. You and I had an interesting catch up and prep call just the other day, and you're doing some really intriguing work. And obviously, we've seen, as usual and as expected, some crossover between what you're working on and some of the things that I'm doing and thinking about. So yeah, so let's get into it. Why don't we start with just a little bit about you and your background and the many hats that you're wearing these days?
Yeah, I'm trying to be more focused in supporting ops and particularly, people ops in terms of how do we actually think about integrating AI into our teamwork. And of course, it really needs to start, well, not of course, unfortunately, which is why we're having this conversation in part, but it needs to start grounded in our humanity and understanding long-term implications of this rapid advancements of artificial intelligence, the impact not only on individuals, teams, and organizations, but society as a whole, and kind of get an understanding of how our decisions will impact our future. And it is one of these things where maybe not quite butterfly theory, but we're certainly the economic purchasing and investment decisions made by executives in terms of which technologies to try and pilot and which vendors to support is going to really determine our future if it's one in which we as humans are replaced from our jobs by AI, or if we are able to be enriched by it and be able to do more with the technology than we could ever do on our own. And in this way, think of it more as a tool as opposed to a replacement or as another human.
Yeah, I think these are some heady topics that a lot of people are grappling with, and I know that I struggle just as I think about terminology, which I know we're going to dive pretty deep into. But as I think about even just the term, human-centric AI, what exactly does that mean in terms of augmenting ourselves or collaborating, with AI? So, are people using it as a tool? I think a lot of people will continue to use it as a tool, but can it be an extension of ourselves? Is it going to sit in meetings for us as we already have a lot of digital, AI powered note takers and things like that. So what does this mean for, our roles, our place in the organization as the organization sort of restructures itself in some ways? And so there's a lot of different ways to think about that, but certainly we want to make sure that we're being fair to, the individual and making sure that they realize their potential, perhaps with the help of AI. And then, you get to more, I guess, hot topics around, does this absorb everything that DEI was intended to be in terms of fairness and inclusion and things like that, and then you get into concepts around human centric design, and then humanity. What does this mean for the global economy and our lives and livelihoods generations to come? So yeah, so a lot to dig into, but like you said, there's a lot of work that you're doing that I'm intrigued by, and I know you teed this up with a LinkedIn post earlier around what do what do we call these sort of digitized versions of ourselves in general, and then specifically in the workplace. And terminology matters because people associate all kinds of things, for better or worse, with what those terms evoke, in their own minds with our own, applying our own, human bias perhaps on top of some of that terminology. So why don't you talk a little bit about, how you think about that?
Yeah, well, first, I just want to ground it what I was sharing before about the directional work of where I'm focused on supporting organizations, but connect that more to the work that I've been doing and the economic issues that I raised. And what it is that I discovered with my co-founder of the Team Flow Institute that using AI while we were meeting together was allowing us to have everything we said tracked and allowing us to be present and remain in flow. And so that led to a kind of understanding that team flow could be a North Star for high performance teams and ultimately high performance organizations. So we got connected with a gentleman by the name of Dr. Jeff Vandenhout out of Eindhoven University over in the Netherlands, who's been doing research around team flow for 10 years, extending on the work around flow states. That is some deep positive psychology stuff, sense of Satori being completely immersed and engrossed in an activity and being just in a peak state, in optimal. And could we achieve that with teams? And where I saw as very important is that we haven't done that work. We don't have enough time usually in our traditional workflows within teams or departments or organizations to spend much more time talking about anything than what we're supposed to do. In fact, Drucker at the beginning of the office age or knowledge work lamented about how productivity is a terrible measure for knowledge work. It's just not the same. But we in part the basis of that knowledge work from those early days was pretty much that we're not going to mechanize like we did the assembly line. We're going to leave the means of which productivity is improved and determined up to the individual workers to figure out on their own. And so every individual over the years since through, the office era, knowledge work era, however you want to refer to it, has basically had to come in and figure it out. And while there's training available and there's skills development and there's all sorts of other personal and professional development opportunities, there still isn't that conversation about how do we work better together. And I first really hit upon this with my first startup now 30 years ago, where I had 6 type A personalities and I couldn't make it work. And so I was left after that kind of failure of not achieving what we had set out to achieve with that question that I've been paying attention to ever since. And what I found was Dr. Vandenhout's team flow model described it. And when we're looking at the world that we're in today, that is going to undergo a significant transformation greater than any we've seen before. And I know we've said this again and again, first with the birth of the PCs, then with the network itself and the internet and DARPANet and Gopher and all that other stuff at the early days of the web before the browser kind of took over and before the API era and all the rest of it, that all of that was going to change the world more than ever before. No, this is fundamentally different. This is not just even about how do you use a tool, it's somewhat how do you work with the tool as well. And so I thought it was very important, given that we really failed a lot of our digital transformation efforts by failing to look at and consider people to the weight and emphasis that we needed to during those digital transformations, that we really need to consider those human factors and indeed our own humanity as we're facing the question of how do we integrate AI into our organizations, into our workflows. And taking that human-centric view ends up being really important. So there's a lot of movement, as you know, around human-centric AI and of course, human factors and CHI, computer-human interaction. There's big, obviously, association around all that, very important stuff. But when we start looking at it for today, one of the things that really arose, and this came out of our roundtable with my research fellows at the Institute, was the idea of AI as a teammate. And so that led me on a path to do more research and start looking at what's going on there. And, I referred to it as digital twin, and I didn't even think about why I did. I'll explain why I did in a moment, I think. And I'm not going to keep going forever here, Bob, I promise. But I'm getting near the end of the point, I think, of your question. But the setup on this one, I think, is very important because these are all considerations that really need to be paid attention to as we start looking at it. But in this sense, what we have is the idea that some of our data, I'm going to talk a little more technically now instead of esoterically, some of our data can inform a version of an artificial intelligence that will be more custom to my needs, that will be more customized based on how I write, on how I ask questions, on the stuff I pay attention to. And indeed, we see that with GPT now in terms of the contextual elements. You can go into your settings and you can tell it how to respond to you. You can let it remember all of your conversations or have it forget all of your conversations. And in that way, now it's pulling up stuff that I talked about with it, a year and a half ago, and it's able to reference that stuff pretty amazingly. And so the question becomes, as we saw with Reid Hoffman put out the fact that he ingested all of his speeches and all of his writings and who knows what else, other personal data inside of it to create a version of an AI that did interviews on his behalf. And in fact, this Read AI, as he called it, he referenced as a digital twin. And I believe largely that's why, if we look at the poll that I put up yesterday, why that's still leading just marginally against the other options. But it's a majority of people right now at 55% out of 22 votes believing digital twin is the terminology for it. I've been working with a bunch of people, John Hagel, John Seeley Brown, Dave Toole, and Gary Bowles now on a Humanizing AI Federation to bring all these efforts together so that everyone can see what everyone else is doing and so that somebody who's interested can find out what else is going on out there in which they could get involved. But in that process, Gary has written very energetically and enthusiastically about the dangers of anthropomorphizing the AI, of giving it too many human characteristics. And of course, we've seen this in movies with her. And in fact, we've seen the terrible stories of people thinking that they were dating an AI and killing themselves, which is just crazy, but it happens. And there's some dark side to this, like every other technology. And I think the choice of our language is going to go a long way towards that. So even the word twin, while in and of itself, there's other technical uses to talk about systems duplication or replicas that we can model and play with and other uses of the term. The other term is the slippery slope that comes in the idea of digital twin. Now, I don't think that we're going to be able to pull that back, quite honestly. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be more considerate with the language we choose and how we're referencing it, because in that way, we're going to influence rather how people are going to respond and interact with it. So I think it's an important time now to raise the issue of what is this thing and how do we reference it? How do we relate to it? What does it do for us? And what is the language we're using to describe it when we're sharing it with others?
Thank you for setting all that context because I think it's important. And Gary Bowles and I have spoken about some of these topics as well, and he's got a great newsletter, and his books, of course, are important here. I think that my reluctance to digital twin is only because, being relatively deep in technology, that term does exist, right? It existed before generative AI and before people were creating these digital representations of themselves to sort of codify all their knowledge and insights and things like that to basically overcome, space and time and bandwidth issues and what have you. And we'll get into, what that means in the context of you as an employee, perhaps in a little bit. But my because I already had a definition of digital twin in my mind, that's really my only reluctance to using it. And when I say that, I mean in the context of sort of digitizing either some non-human entity or some physical environment, like a manufacturing facility or a complex, mechanical device or something like that. You've literally made a digital representation, an exact digital representation of a physical entity or environment, so that you can do thorough and elaborate sort of testing of the interoperability of the parts of that environment and the different factors, and you could so imagine, just for the audience sake, imagine if you have a digital twin of a car, you don't have to do so much physical crash test dummy style testing with these, like, airport hangar sized facilities, and then constantly smashing up all these cars that you just spent time and money building. And so how do you do that effectively? But in those environments, you are really getting down to every minute detail of everything in terms of you know you know wind resistance and you know the interaction of different chemicals or whatever it is, and you can sort of physically represent that. So this is a little bit, we're talking about sort of digitizing someone's what's inside someone's brain, how they think, what they think, their their experience and knowledge and things like that. It's not the same as just gathering up all the sort of digital exhaust and all the things that I've shared publicly. It's much deeper than that. And so I know people have done it. I've interacted with some of these sort of digital advisors, if you want to call them that, as well. I've interacted with them before, and it's actually quite effective. You could argue it's definitely not the exact same as having a conversation with another human being, but if they are unavailable, either for time reasons or monetarily, you can't afford to book an hour of their time or whatever the reason is, it's a nice and reasonable proxy for what you want. But it depends on what your objectives are, and depends on if you work for someone else, what their expectations are about your availability, your knowledge, or whatever. But I know we want to talk about, what exactly would that mean for you, because a lot of the situation now and a lot of the pushback and resistance that we see from workers is similar to what we saw when people started down the robotic process automation path, starting, a decade, 12 years ago, is, well, you're basically asking me to take my knowledge and encode it, codify it into this rules based system back then, and now a more dynamic, context aware, kind of system. So this is slippery slope, right? Because once I've given you everything that's in my head, and you've now extracted all that institutional knowledge and experience, and you understand the relationships I've built and all these other sort of intellectual capital that you've built. If you have now just basically put that into a silicon based system rather than a carbon based one, what does that mean for my life and livelihood?
First of all, it's really important to, as you were just doing, kind of shaping what is the thing that we're trying to figure out the symbol for. And so I do think of the linguistic choices here, just as I do what symbol do we use for it, and that if we can all agree upon the symbol, then we understand the broader thing. And so you've started to address several of the different ways in which it can be used and how it's built and those components. And there's more of that to discuss. But before I go further into that, I want to come back to the naming itself of it, to set up, how is it being used more specifically, and go further into some of the things you pointed out, particularly around what it means for employees, because I think there's significant potential consequences to our needing to not only, in this case, understand the language, but also understand the broader use and implications around it. And that's where, I'm going to be focused for the next couple of months is, moving towards exploring more of these uses of AI as a collaborator, as a sounding board, as an idea generator, as a repository of my thoughts that will serve myself in internal dialogue, in remembering things and being able to think about it differently, and how to build tangents off of it that I otherwise wouldn't, be doing on my own. And in this way, coming back to the digital twin thing, yes, the system side, but I also want to add to that the other side in NFTs. My co-founder, Jamie Schwartz, has a company called Marked.art that is actually embedding NFT digital twins into objects, including things like DJ sets, music files, as well as physical objects like luxury handbags or things like that. And they're actually doing that in the city in New York, and some fascinating usage of it in that way. But when we look at it from those two perspectives, what we see, because we're inside of IT systems, because we're inside of crypto and blockchain and understand that a lot, is different than what the world sees. And, we have to take into account how other people see it. And again, one of the reasons I think digital twin has become so prominent, even to where I'm using it, is because Reed did all those interviews when he released his book. And so that was on the Today Show, that was on CNBC, that was on all the major news networks, as well as a whole bunch of other podcast and blogger interviews he did. And so that's kind of people's first instance of it, that it is sort of this digital pseudo version of a human being or an expert thought leader executive. And certainly it can be used in that way. But when we start thinking about the actual use cases that you started going through, this is where talking with Jamie and thinking about it and doing the research, where we really landed on a preference for calling it personal intelligence. And the reason being is that it's subset, if you will, or a differentiation of artificial intelligence. It is still artificial, but it's something that is unique to me as a person. And it is something as well that if you follow the lead of like the folks at Purifina who are doing this sort of technology now, they're big believers in privacy and data ownership and data rights, that we should own our own data. And so they're baking into their versions not only that sort of idea of you own your data, you own your personal intelligence. And again, they call it actually, I believe, an AI digital twin or something along those lines. And there's a bunch of different terms, and it's fighting out once again what's going to emerge in the same way that we did with social media some 25 years ago or whatever that was at this point, 20 years ago. And so that's why this conversation is really important, I think. But we really love personal intelligence because it fits into all these different use cases where I don't know. For me, on the linguistic side, I listen for things that sing and sound like harmonious in some way. And when we ran it through a bunch of the different use cases and applications, it kind of fit with all of them. And we can talk more about those, I think, here a little bit more. But the one that's most interesting right now from the perspective of our research and what have you is the relationship between an individual, whether they're an employee, a contractor, or otherwise, and the work they're doing for an organization, and who owns the personal intelligence that could be also called an employee intelligence. And how is that compensated for? And do we end up in a situation where we get to a point that companies who are out there building agents right now designed to do certain functions that are already taking away jobs, do we end up at a point where a company can just mine all of my Outlook, mine all of my Slack, mine all of my commentary across the social networks and posts and everything else, and build a version of my personal intelligence as their employee intelligence and fire me? And what are the implications for that in terms of the relationship, the employment contract itself? Because right now we are signing away all that data with most employment agreements. So if you are working in a big company, chances are legally they could do that to you right now. Or are we going to set it up in such a way that there is something maybe like a personal intelligence license that the company would need to pay me for to be able to continue to use that data after I'm gone, after I'm out of the organization? And then, of course, we get into what situations is that useful. Obviously, over decades, we've seen, Bob, with IBM and others, the need to capture institutional knowledge as it ages out or as it leaves out the front door, as people have been long saying that, your most valuable assets walk out your door every night. And how do we look at the implications for organizational design and really some of these more meaty issues of not just what's happening this year, what's happening in 5 years, and how do organizational leaders of massive multinationals think about the integration of AI into their workforces, into their workflows, and into their future planning?
Yeah, there's so many directions we could take this conversation because I feel like, well, I'll start with, you went back to terminology, so I'll start there. I do like personal intelligence. It's funny, you and I both talk about like collective intelligence quite a bit, and I always struggle with how to frame, well, like what's the singular of that? Like how do I back into that? Like, is it? I often say just, sort of human intelligence, individually and collectively, something along those lines. But it's a little clunky, right? There's no, clean. sort of phrase, and sometimes I struggle with just the the word intelligence, right? Because we are more than just the sort of we're more than just the knowledge, right? So what do they? We've got to look at, you know, all these human, what I would argue that the more durable skills of the future are all related to what's in your head mostly. And, but that's, emotion and leadership and critical thinking and systems thinking and all of these other traits. And so,
This is William Tincup, and I'd like to direct you to a wonderful limited series podcast that Ryan and I recorded live at the ERE Recruiting Innovation Summit. We sat down with 20 recruiting and TA leaders from around the world to hear what today's best recruiters are doing to stay sharp, stay relevant, and stay ahead. It's called The Talent Shift. You'll love it. You'll find the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Listen, like, review, share. Do you?
but I don't know that there's a better sort of singular term without getting into when you talk about creating a replica of that. A lot of the other terms that I've heard, and even some of my AI assistants have come up with some relatively dystopian kinds of terms, like your personal echo or your mind clone and things like this, which just don't. That's never gonna. That's never gonna reach
Yeah,
mass
and
adoption.
once again, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to throw this in right in here
Yeah,
because there is actually a better term, but it's technical and it's not something that the mainstream will adopt. So it's about understanding the symbolism, linguistics, mass media uptake, consumption, sharing, and the rest of it, and being able to make it something that is more relatable and less confusing so that it can be carved out in a unique way. And so when we look at that stack, there is, even as I wrote about this actually on LinkedIn in an article called From Self to Systems, the idea that in order for teams to work well together, we need individuals with emotional intelligence who can apply relational intelligence, understanding how to relate to others, together to with the team intelligence, the composition and nature of the team and how you build it and how it expresses itself, which gets into more cultural sort of issues around it. And so the more correct technical term, and I'm going to try this for the first time because it just started coming to me, but it is around cognition. And that it's actually, I believe, and let's see if I can get right what I was just thinking of. It's the idea of an instance of a individual's cognition as represented by the data from their communications, their writings, and from their explicit instructions and information input into it. And in that way, from there, it gets deployed into participating in meetings on my behalf, whether passively or actively, whether it's passively giving me back information on what happened and what people talked about through the filter of my own concerns and my own cognition or not. But that's where, again, to your point of the collective intelligence, it really fits, I think, because it goes well from personal intelligence to I could talk about it in the same way that I don't want to talk about in marketing. I don't want to call people audiences, right? I want to call them people and humans and think of them in a more humanistic way. And that affects our customer experience design and so much more. But that we do have a context in which we're in a meeting, we got to talk about the target market or the audience. And it's not personal. And in that way, employee intelligence fits within that context. But I can send my personal intelligence to a meeting to listen and report back to me. I can send my personal intelligence to a meeting as a representative of what I know and my project knowledge or experience or the information that I have access to. And so in that way, that then moves up to the collection of all of that for the first time ever, really, to this extent, with your background in knowledge management. I know you're familiar with this too, but for the first time ever, where we have a almost easily captured organizational intelligence that can be made accessible to the whole of the organization, that will allow us to be more effective, to co-create value better, to waste less time, and to, essentially create what I've written about before as the AI dividend that will allow us to invest that time back instead of tasking everyone to 125% and burning them all out and getting sick and all the rest of the implications, to where maybe we're working at 70%. And that 30% extra time can be invested in how do we work better together, understanding the how of the process and considering our human factors. And then on top of that, how do we look at the interplay with, oh my God, I lost my thread. I'm sorry. I thought I could grab it back, but I lost it. Damn it. I went too far. I'm sorry, Bob.
No, I was trying to keep up, and I think where you were going gets into some other issues around, does it have to be a perfect representation of you? Like
Oh, good
if you could,
point.
if 80% of you could be in every meeting, so you never had a meeting conflict again, right? If 80% of you showed up in that meeting, wouldn't that be enough? Because maybe there's a meeting that's early in the morning and you didn't have coffee yet and you're not contributing as much as you used to, or maybe you're in a bad mood, or maybe you're falling asleep after lunch, or whatever. There's all these reasons why you may not be at 100%. I mean, to say we're human beings, right? We are not robots. And so we're not always going to be at peak performance, 9 hours a day or whatever your schedule is, right? So when is it good enough? Is it only in meetings where we're making actual decisions? Because otherwise, couldn't I send my proxy, my personal intelligence, to a bunch of other meetings, and we could argue, is that enough? Did you extract enough information from that meeting? Maybe you didn't. Maybe you're missing some of the nonverbal cues from others in the meeting if you're not physically there, or whatever. I mean, that's something for the next generation to sort of figure out, whether you have an actual physical element of this digital proxy or what have you.
And again, this is where we got into, and Team Flow has really helped guide us. And it doesn't need to be the thing for everyone. I really see it as a string theory for a lot of these best practices, and we hang a lot of other books inside of the model that Dr. Vandenhout created. But this is where we really landed on the idea that, and people have been bitching about meetings for way too long. You have to sit there and listen to it, whereas we have the Khan Academy reverse classroom style where, listen to the speech in advance on your own on video when you can find the time to do it. And then when we get together, do what only we can do together, and taking that sort of mixture of ideas. And where Jamie has, my co-founder, Jamie Schwartz, has hit upon this idea of moving from meetings to collaborative conversations where only the real principles need to be involved, because we're able to get the transcript, because we're able to send our personal intelligence to it. Now, within that, there is still what is the type of meeting? Is it a decision-making meeting? Is it a status update like a daily stand-up? Is it actually a creation meeting or co-creation meeting? What's the nature of the meeting itself affects this somewhat. But then we get into the other issue that you raised, which is really important. And I think of this in terms of the fidelity that we get from the personal intelligence. And largely speaking, to your point, we're not going to have a high fidelity version of me. And in fact, when we start deploying this on the web, like through my website, where you can go and interact with one of my own personal intelligence chatbots that I've set up, you can get better access to my writings and some of my thinking. But I don't know if that's 60% of me, 80, whatever that is, but you don't get that human component that can respond in the moment creatively, that can do some of these other things that are unique to humans, and why we need to protect and emphasize the value and dignity of human work. And in that way, what we really need to do is what I've been talking about as calibrated trust with these agents or with these intelligences that we have, and to understand and have awareness that it isn't the full me in a meeting. The fact that it might not have been updated because the cron job didn't run in the past 2 weeks, so it doesn't have all the last status updates from what we've been talking about yesterday. And as a result of that, you can't rely on it entirely. You still need to go back and do an extra process step to validate it. Or in the case of where I've put out a public version of this for people to interact with, where it's actually known that if you really want to get the real stuff, you need to pay to get time access to me instead of just access to my lower fidelity personal intelligence.
I don't know who's sort of calibrating that, right? Like, is there another AI that's overseeing? Is there a meeting
Well,
AI
it's a
that
media
oversees it?
literacy, right? That's what I've seen you writing about a lot, AI literacy and getting
Yeah,
this. It's a subcomponent of AI literacy.
yeah. There's definitely a bunch of facets to that. I mean, obviously, ethical use, understanding privacy and cybersecurity implications, but really like you understand. Can you explain, or can the builder explain what this AI is doing and how its logic works without revealing, IP? But can you explain the conclusions that it drew from the information that it was given? Do you looking back to the data to understand the data quality, the data provenance, and the veracity of the data that went into the algorithms? Otherwise, everything that comes out is suspect. So yeah, I mean, those are all absolutely components of AI literacy, and then that leads into readiness. Do I know how to actually take advantage of all that I now know and use it to the betterment of my own sort of capability and output and potential from your own career trajectory standpoint, but also contributing to the team and to the organization, and what's the optimal way to think about that. I mean, you're you're bringing up some several IBM tenure memories about a proposal I had, collective intelligence. I called it CHOW, collective intelligence analytics and optimization. So how do you build the optimal team? How do you pull the right people into a decision making body such that you have the cognitive diversity that you need to make better decisions? And so it's interesting to think about, could you stick a bunch of digital twins or proxies in a meeting with maybe one human and just see what happens, which is kind of funny. I say that having just joined a call a couple hours ago where the call must have gotten rescheduled because it was me and six AI note takers. I almost just started talking just to like hold my own meeting and just to see what happened, because I'll probably get copies of a couple of them. It'd be funny to see, compare like Otter to Fireflies to Read.ai and some of the others. But anyway, I think there's a lot that goes back. Even when you were talking about, this sort of digital exhaust and all the things that you've published definitely goes back to those social business transformation days at IBM, where we were basically trying to shift everyone's mindset to say, you know, the value, instead of you being the bottleneck of knowledge, and knowledge is power kind of thing. Sharing is power. Share that knowledge. You will be acknowledged and noticed, both you know literally and through digital, the social analytics. You will be acknowledged as an influencer and an expert in those areas. Which gets into the whole social capital kind of concept of, you know what can you do now that people have sort of tagged you as a linchpin in the knowledge flow around a particular topic, and isn't that the best way forward? And so when I think about these digital twins, I mean, it's that and so much more, because not everyone likes to share all the things that they know publicly that can be, picked up by some of these, text analytics and social analytics tools. So you're already shortchanging yourself by not tapping into all those people who are just not, sharing their knowledge more broadly. But there's so much. I mean, that kind of bleeds into the fact that a lot of top talent gets overlooked because they just don't
Yep.
they're not raising their voice loud enough.
To that point, you're starting to get into, the potential to get some on the upside of this, to get more meritocratic compensation for the quality of the personal intelligence, for the quality of your inputs, for the amount people rely on you for your expertise or knowledge or ability to connect the dots and do these things. And, how does that get integrated into compensation structures? Well, first of all, how does it get integrated into employment agreements so that like the use of my personal intelligence that is generated from all of my employee communications contributions and potentially others, if negotiated, the stuff that I write externally, well, maybe the stuff I write externally isn't for the exclusive use because it's mine and I can have a Creative Commons style licensing on how much of it you get to use. But where that's considered in the actual compensation package. And if it's not considered as a part of the actual salary or the hourly work, depending on how it's being done, is it then at least accounted for the future when I leave? And what happens with all of that data? And will you pay me a personal intelligence license fee of $5,000 a year so long as you're using that within your organizational or collective intelligence? And so I see this as definitely one of many ways that executives are going to implement this stuff as we go forward. It's certainly, as we know, not in line with their desire to keep a tight bottom line and do the cost cutting that's driving things today. But I believe that it is ultimately the best value because it is the factor that turns the war for talent. That companies who care about their people and look after them and compensate them properly and have transparent systems of looking at meritocratic recognition and compensation and the rest of it, that they are more desirable employers and they have the best pick of the best talent to be able to look at when they're, expanding the organization. So I definitely see it. And in that way, as we kind of hinted on the other day, but I'm seeing even more now as we talk about this, there's definitely an entire service around this that we could be rolling out to help companies navigate through this to solve for these problems. And again, this is one of the places where us with our little bit of gray and our beard have a little more experience to be able to generalize and contextualize how this emerging technology fits into this, a wide array of systems and components and functionalities and workflows, and understanding the different organizational cultures and how it impacts those and how we can think about it all holistically. Because at this time, literally everything is about to change inside every large organization. And it already has with places like Shopify and Klarna and several others.
Yeah, I mean, I think once you've started, I mean, we've already gone well down this path for anybody who is. I mean, you pointed out some examples that have been in the headlines, but there's definitely many many other examples of where they've built armies of agents. I saw one this morning. Somebody had replaced. Oh, it was like a financial services firm. They had already created like 30 digital versions of some of their like equity analysts, right? So you're you're sort of dramatically collapsing, time to value for a lot of the activities that these folks were doing. Now they weren't making any decisions. They weren't like executing trades autonomously, although we already have programmatic buying and stuff to that. But it was more, look, these people they had given their approval. They had checked and validated everything that was output basically under their likeness, if you will. And but what does that mean? I mean, are they sitting on a beach in the Caribbean, or are they doing other things? Are they providing oversight? I mean, one of the things that I know has been a conversation of late is, does the compensation that you get going forward, does that now cover you and the knowledge in your head wherever that gets applied? I mean, I feel like some of these things predate any of the AI discussion, you could argue, right? I mean, you talk about knowledge management before. I mean, that was the point. That's why some of these firms exist. Professional services firms exist. It is the aggregation of their experience and knowledge that gives them value in the first place and allows them to charge such, high ticket, contracts and things like that. And so, we'll see what happens with that industry along with others. But I feel like, how do you how would you even price that? I mean, I'm trying to play this out a couple steps ahead. I mean, once you've codified your knowledge into this digital agent, which everyone is being asked to do, I don't know how companies are necessarily framing, the value of that to them, or they're just saying, well, your knowledge and your output is our property. so so it's technically ours, and we have the upper hand no matter how you want to or try to navigate this going forward. But at the same time, you could just as easily walk and then take all that institutional or the rest of your institutional knowledge elsewhere. But there's a lot more than just like the knowledge in your head, and that gets into some of the more human skills, and as well as the the relationships and the reputation that you have as a trusted collaborator and leader, and things like that. So there's a lot of intangibles, or at least less tangible factors that go into you know who you are as a contributor and as a value creator for the organization.
Yeah, not to skip over or not to even go too deep, I guess, rather into the technical side, but it's an important consideration here because, as Paul Jurcis, I'm sorry, Paul, if I mispronounce your last name, Jurcis, I believe, Jurcys, from Pirafina told me when I interviewed him about this. There is I've spent so much time on his name, I almost forgot the point that I was gonna make again, so let me come back to it. Oh, there is the matter of curating and crafting the data set that is the basis of this personal intelligence, and in the same way that if you ingest an entire transcript of a meeting, including all the niceties about, "Oh, yeah, oh, are you finished with your flu yet?" "Oh, good, I'm not, sending it out both ends," or this other stuff, that ends up being extraneous data that not only increases the cost of the compute, which we all need to be thinking about now, given the amount of water being used and energy and everything else, but it also pollutes the purity and the focus and the potential quality of the intelligence itself. And so the curation model, with a couple of them that I saw, allowed me to point at every document I could through a multi-cloud like interface and just ingest it all. So it took in my entire blog, including the post from January 17th, 2009, that was my links for the day, or my photo of the day, or whatever else, or a little thing saying, "Hey, I'm back. I'll be writing more next week." And I guess that's useful in some ways if we want to get to higher fidelity of me and the emotional stuff, but it doesn't help with the real value of the intelligence itself for this specific purpose that we're trying to use it for. So how we curate it, how we edit it is very important. And that was one of the things I really liked about what Pirafina is doing, is they are actually really making you convert everything into text files to simplify it and to be very specific about what it is that you're including in it. So the process of ongoing curation by somebody managing their personal intelligence license in a marketplace, for say, which I also see as something that's an inevitability here, for other people to pick up and use in their organizations is pretty friggin' high, in the same way that I could have an entire business creating an agent that's an SEO expert. And in that way, ingest all of the industry knowledge, refine it, tweak it, write more controls on top of it, have product managers, have knowledge curators, have process developers, have a whole bunch of other efforts going in to refine and increase the quality of the intelligence itself, and to license it in some ways right now, as already is being happening, as a digital employee. And so, that's definitely going to happen. And my question is, you know, who is where is the information for that digital employee coming from? Is it being sucked up by some of the big AI models using copyrighted information that they don't have any legal rights to? Or is it actually being licensed from experts in the field? And in that way, are they being used as part of the marketing campaign around it and getting compensation for it or not? And in part, that's what drove me to write the essay on the loop, this idea that we could come together and form guilds and actually collaborate on that curation, collaborate on our knowledge sharing, and to build a sort of agent version of our personal intelligence that would support a given function or role inside of other organizations, whether it was in an advisory capacity or for a production level quantity of work on an ongoing basis. But such a way that those people who contribute to that and who help shape the intelligence itself are able to participate in the future income that it generates. And in that way, create a more fair, decentralized, and distributed version of the equity that is being generated based on the intellectual property, knowledge, experience, and wisdom of the people who actually lived that sort of knowledge and refined it and invested their life, their sweat, their blood, their tears into learning it and distilling it in such a way that could make it more useful. And so I'm really still obviously very jazzed about that. And I really hope somebody someday goes, Chris, I want to do that. Here's $10 million. Let's go build that.
Yeah, let me know when you get that call. Yeah, no, I love where you're going with this. I mean, I feel like I talk about responsible AI and I talk about human-centric AI, and those are not exactly the same thing, but if they were a Venn diagram, the intersection would be this sort of responsible innovation, I guess is one way to think about it. But what is the appropriate mechanism to leverage that knowledge that you've accumulated or that you just innately have, and how can you
Are you tired of talent and HR podcasts that sound like corporate training videos? Same. Talentless is the no-fluff show about hiring, leadership, culture, and what's actually going on in the world of work. Talentless is a podcast for recruiters by recruiters. Hosted by Desiree Goldie and Ashley King, they're smart, occasionally salty, and never afraid to say what everyone else is thinking. Listen wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe at talentlesspodcast.com.
be in a position such that you can replicate that? So today, you're getting all kinds of issues with people entering a company. Maybe it was a fraudulent candidate. Maybe they used AI throughout the interview, process, and they can't do the work that they claim to be able to do, or they find out that this person, some of this was about the return to office, right? Well, I can't trust the remote people. Not that they're not working, but they're working for me and five other, companies, right? Because they've written scripts and then whatever, however they're able to pull it off. Maybe they don't sleep. I don't know. But, but, you have a friend or a colleague who was working on like fraction of a fraction. So not just doing fractional work, but could you do fractions of a fraction and be sort of on retainer with multiple companies? Well, technically you remove the bandwidth problem. You even remove the temporal problem where you could literally be working simultaneously, for contributing to multiple guilds in your example, or multiple similar projects. I mean, for me, as I help a lot of like talent acquisition technology and HR technology startups. I mean, technically, if I had, let's just say hypothetically, I had, five of them as clients and they were all doing some version of like AI, interviewing and AI assessments and, things like that. So they weren't necessarily direct competitors, but they were overlapping. A lot of the knowledge and a lot of the advice that I would give them is the same. I mean, why couldn't I just do that, replicated over, and then they tap into whatever aspects of my knowledge and insight and expertise that they need. And if they run into issues or there's something else, then they pick up the phone and or text me or whatever, and then they can tap into the full 100% of me. But I do, we were talking the other day about like what is the model, and unless there's something beyond sort of licensing that I'm not quite thinking about or not, it's not coming to mind. It just seems logical that you could basically, license me. So license like, Bob as a service, or, however you need to, frame it, having access to me and what I know and what I've seen has value. And, if you can get, again, some significant percentage of me and my brain, why can't that be Bob's, you know, Bob's extra brain, charge it 200 an hour instead of 300, whatever.
I'm really glad you brought this up because this gets down to some fundamentals in regards to how organizations are built and how work is structured today. And there's a couple of things that shift here. Number one is our primary limiting belief or factor is based on the legal relationship between me as talent and any organization. And I've always looked at it, and for myself, that I've been able to play with, as I say, three levers. With I'm doing work with somebody, sharing my intellectual property and my time and my wisdom and whatever else. It's what's the personal and professional satisfaction I get from it? What is the income that it generates for me specifically? And what is the equity in the asset that I'm contributing to building? And I'm able to spin those dials or move those levers in different ways by every opportunity that presents itself. And I typically have not done that through employment relationships. I've done that as an independent. But as we look at independence in this way, what's the difference between, you know, doing this sort of knowledge work in this way and being a musician participating in multiple bands? The constraint and the concern, there's two reasonable concerns an organization has. Number one, you're not giving me your real attention and you're not engaged and you don't care. Well, we can address that through transparency, engagement, and other conversations and through what we show in our work. And then there's more to it, but I know we're running out of time, so I want to be focused on this, which is actually the ability to be outcome focused. And that's one of the things that, like my friend who's working on and investing in a company that is looking to replace marketing agencies and all of the functions from website design to ad placement to strategy to the bidding and everything. Just do it all in one agent instead of an agency and charging a flat fee per month and letting one person just send it wild to do whatever it needs to do on its own autonomously. I'm a little scared of that, but it's going to get better and it's going to perfect itself and it's going to be as good as a team. But again, what's that knowledge based on? Who is it there? There's no reason why you as an individual can't shape that version of your personal intelligence into such a way that somebody could license it, or they could hire you to guide that intelligence in such a way such that you give a minimum amount of hours a month to in-person meetings, to contextualizing the information, to validating what the low fidelity intelligence developed originally to make sure that it's the right stuff. And in that way, not just getting the output, but again, calibrating the trust through the actual human evaluation and refinement of the outputs that the intelligence generates. And it really comes down to another deeper issue, which is value-based pricing. And I've tried to do value-based pricing since my first interactive agency in the mid-late 90s. People don't like it. They're not used to buying that way. So there's a whole hump to overcome there. But I think this is a really good place to fit it in. And what happens and I've actually had a job that I went to apply to that I thought was really cool. I'm like, wow, that'd be great to work with these guys. And they required to have access to all of my biometric data and like for perpetuity. And I'm like, no, they're not going to have that because then you can sell that as an asset. And I don't believe that's fair. But they were doing it because they were afraid that somebody would be working 7 jobs and ultimately taking Upwork screenshots to the next level, wanted biometric recognition during billable hours to validate that I was there physically through my biometric imprint and digital information on that and, whatever. But that's all because they have the framing of thinking of somebody as an employee who they need to observe, who can't be trusted, who they need to watch and monitor closely because surely they're out to like screw us, instead of actually trying to contribute to the collective ambition and achieve our greater purpose together.
This goes back to trust, right? And because people are taking a lot of creative liberties with the way they represent themselves in a tough labor market, I'm sure has exacerbated that situation. But the candidate fraud, the misrepresentation, the exaggerated and embellished credentials, the fake credentials, like none of this is obviously helping build trust. And I think what you bring up is also important to think about going forward, even from the broader sort of macro level labor market, where we're still seeing quite a shift towards freelance and gig work, right? And so you don't even have, in that situation, you don't even have the same expectations and contractual obligations as you would if you were an employee, and that includes your likeness, your social capital, your digital twin as that exists. So as an independent advisor and strategist like myself, or if I were to go take on some fractional project work or whatever, you know I guess the basis of the work will dictate how effective a digital proxy would be in some of those engagements. But if I were to try to go out and just say, put me on retainer, but you'll have ongoing access to my digital twin, I mean, there's still quite a bit of value there. I'll give you a discounted rate, like I was alluding to before, to have access to it. But I mean, even ChatGPT, I have, you probably have them too. I mean, I have custom, GPTs that I've created that I've even made public, but I mean, people probably don't know unless they just stumble upon them. But they haven't really created a way for me to, monetize that. And but I feel like I absolutely could if I codified enough of my knowledge and trained it and tweaked it, especially if it had like my learned from my writing to have my sort of personal brand kind of voice to it. I mean, there's a lot of ways that could be used. There's also a lot of ways that could be misused, which is a whole other conversation.
Yeah, well, I see again, and I don't know. I haven't talked to Dan Martell in quite a while, but I've been watching what he's doing with his McLaren regularly. And, he built and sold Maven. I think he sold it. I don't know that he's running it anymore, but which was a dial in expert sort of thing and pay per minute, the ultimate form of fraction of a fractional access to an executive. Solve a given problem, have a conversation, pay for 17 minutes or whatever. But I see that same sort of marketplace being available to these personal intelligences that we would license or make available to people. And what that is that, to your point earlier, transcends space and time to make me accessible to people over in Paris at Station F and other, entrepreneur accelerators around the world. And that's the first taste. And you get a certain amount of access, and we got a freemium model going on it. And then after that point, you got to pay to have a membership or subscription to be able to use it and turn to it regularly. And then from there, there's a one click that connects to the scheduling application to actually book time with me at the $300 or $400 an hour, because me live now is worth a tremendous amount more than it is what you're getting the copies of the lower fidelity versions of my personal intelligence.
That's right.
So again, this is where, I got to meet you as a futurist and the rest of this stuff. I just see this as an inevitability. And what I'm hoping for is to find people who are looking to build this stuff so we can help build it with them, right?
I think you're doing fantastic work, and I'm really bullish on what you're building. I think it's such thoughtful work that a lot of people just don't really think about. But if you're really starting to think, H1, H2 kind of horizon about how this stuff evolves in a constructive and ethical, responsible way, and maintains that human centricity as we, hopefully innovate responsibly, as I like to say. We've got to think about these things and how to get the most out of people and help them recognize that AI can add a lot of value to to their own growth plans, whether that's personal or professional or both. But we do need to be careful, and we need to learn how to use these tools properly. But we also need to hold organizations accountable. Even while legislation is being developed, we know that it's going to always trail innovation and experimentation. So we just need to really be careful, going back to the trust, theme of who we're trusting with our data, not shortchanging, the value of all the knowledge and contributions that we make to teams and to organizations. And hopefully we have a non-dystopian future ahead of us, humans plus AI.
Well, again, with the work like what you're doing with Ross Dawson and everything, there's a lot of really good, smart people who are working on it. I am fearful, though, that the buyers right now are the CIOs and CTOs, and that they're not looking at what we're seeing. They're looking at RAG, they're looking at MCP, and they're looking at the technical elements of how easy it is to put this together now. And, I mean, just even connecting any application, to Gemini or to GPT, OpenAI credits. It's just so simple now to integrate it. And even, while there's still some fear of how much bleed of your intellectual property is going into a large language model like an Anthropic or an OpenAI, their enterprise precautions are in place in such a way that you should be able to really compartmentalize all that data and information in a way that's meaningful. And I know of at least one other effort that is approaching it as an AI firewall that makes for a really interesting way to protect your data and protect your proprietary knowledge and information. So, but again, these aren't necessarily things that are being talked about in the we've got to keep up with the competition. We got to move as fast as possible. We've got to do technology first, which, as the report we just published, is what led to a large percentage of digital transformation failures. So we've got to stop repeating those mistakes. I mean, I've known that since the first time I ran into an IT project in the late 90s, that the reason it failed is because they didn't talk to the users before they made the technology selection. And then they didn't train them beyond going, here's a video, here's how you use it. And that was it. And they invested such a small amount into training and development of being able to actually produce the outcomes. And then, of course, there's the whole other side of products promoting that they can do things that they can't. I just ran into that actually with an integration on a CRM platform. And they said, oh, we can do this thing. It cost my small business client like $2,000, $3,000 because they lied and said that it would do something that it couldn't do. And so all these different factors mix to really make a lot of people jaded and upset, and it doesn't have to. We can be a little more mindful. What we need to do is understand that humans don't scale. We're going too damn fast. We need to slow down and understand our first principles, establish our values of where we want to head with it, and then have that inform our technology decision and our planning for how do we actually create the value that is being promised within this technology.
Yeah, no, I think those are important points. Certainly, I have some of the same, transformation battle scars back in the day, and you're right. I mean, I see it every single day with these, shiny objects being promoted by marketing teams have taken some creative liberties, and just to come full circle, terminology has meaning, right? It has impact, and if you use it incorrectly, then you're going to get called out for these false promises. And I mean, just, you know, basic automation versus, generative AI, that's one pretty broad difference where people are just commingling and jumbling, terminology. So these things matter. So Chris, I think we need to leave it there, but this has been great. And thanks for all the work that you're doing. We will definitely continue to see areas where we can collaborate. And so looking forward to seeing your continued journey and progress. And that report you guys just came out with, I'm happy to put a link in the show notes to that report, and anything else you want to throw out there to most.
Likewise, Bob. I'm really glad to see what you're doing with AIQ and leading in this direction. One of the things that has long inhibited me from doing more of this is thinking like, this is something people already know. But it's not. It's not evenly distributed, as Neil Stevens says, right? So we have to get out there and do more of this distribution. So being on the front lines of trying to educate, inform, create awareness, and help direct people to the right sort of outcomes is really important work. And I think we can go a lot deeper on this. There's a lot more to talk about here. Although we covered quite a bit of it, there's a lot more inside each of these little parts of our conversation that we could talk more about, and
Absolutely.
hope to do that over the weeks and months ahead.
Likewise. Awesome. All right, Chris. Thanks again. Thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you next time.